This is a magnificent area in Liverpool. We've got St. George's Hall here, the library down there, the Walker Art Gallery, which I'm hoping to go in soon and see the Tudors exhibit, and then just over here, the County Sessions House. Everywhere you look, there's just magnificent architecture.
In this video, I will take you along on our visit to the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. First, I will show you some favorite bits of a few permanent collections on display, and then I will share a detailed tour through the temporary exhibition that was there last August, a special collection called The Tudors: Passion, Power, and Politics. The Walker is the National Gallery of the North, housing one of the biggest British art collections outside London. And yes, I'm not gonna lie, I had a good feeling about this place the minute I saw the magenta sign. Ian and I are completely overwhelmed by this art gallery. We really wish we had a day, or at least half a day, to wander through it rather than the hour and a half we had. But what I'm gonna do is just show you a little bit of the Victorian art that we looked at and loved.
This gorgeous room, which not only has amazing paintings, but beautiful silk wallpaper, is of paintings from the 17 and 1800s. All right, I've just entered the Victorian art exhibit. We're not to the Tudors exhibit yet, but this room, it's the first room I've come in and it's already just absolutely magnificent. I do really appreciate about Queen Victoria what a proponent she and her husband Albert were of the arts and how much they encouraged artistic expression during her reign. This fireplace is from Dorchester House in London. And it's always interesting to me when architectural elements like this are transported to museums. It's wonderful to preserve them. I just absolutely love this painting. I love how it just looks like a very realistic depiction of a family with the boy in the middle digging into his food because he's really hungry. This kid over here who's picky and doesn't want to eat anything. Grandma over here cutting some meat off of the ham or whatever it is. The mom over here feeding the horse through the door. I think it's just a charming depiction of a moment in a family's life. This is another painting that just captured my eye because of the story it tells. You see these men questioning this little boy in blue with his blonde hair and his fine clothing. Looks to be his sister crying behind them, and other members of the family nervously waiting behind that. So the story behind it is, the name of the painting is "And When Did You Last See Your Father?" It's in a royalist manor house during the English Civil War. The young boy is being questioned as to the whereabouts of his father as his family members anxiously listen on. Arthur Hughes painted this of As You Like It in 3 panes. It's just really fanciful and romantic. Beautiful painting, I love it. This painting was done in 1905. It's a painting illustrating a traditional folk ballad, and it describes Ellen, who is bearing the child of her heartless lover. He insists that Ellen serve him as a page, and in this painting, she's shown dressing in male clothing, just about to cut off her long, beautiful hair so that she can look like a boy, and her dress and wimple are discarded in the foreground. I love this painting. It's called Ploughing, Valley of the Conway, just showing life in Wales from the mid-1800s. Isn't this a funny picture? Makes you wonder what this chap's doing.
And now for the main attraction, the Tudors exhibit. The Tudors were a powerful English royal dynasty that ruled from 1485 to 1603. The Tudors oversaw the expansion of England's global influence through exploration and colonization, and the Tudor period is often considered a time of significant cultural change and artistic achievement. The Tudors had a profound effect on the course of English and world history. They also helped solidify England's position as a major European power and laid the foundation for the country's future global empire. The Tudors' impact can still be felt today in the Anglican Church and the cultural and political legacies of the Tudor period. Let's look at artwork of some key figures of this era and talk about the stories of passion, power, and politics. This early portrait of Henry VII shows the king holding a red rose, the symbol of the House of Lancaster. Painted shortly after Elizabeth of York's death, it was made to negotiate marriage between the widowed Henry VII and Margaret of Savoy. These talks were not successful, and Henry never remarried. The Tudors trace back to Henry's grandfather, the Welsh courtier Owen Tudor. This image of Elizabeth of York is based on a group of portraits that Henry VII commissioned of the new Tudor royal family. This version was painted after Elizabeth's death and shows her holding a white rose, the symbol of the House of York. Elizabeth was the daughter of the Yorkist King Edward IV and sister of Edward V. Yorkist support for Elizabeth was key to ending the Wars of the Roses and securing the Tudor dynasty, or dynasty if you prefer. This impressive full-length portrait is one of the earliest portraits of Henry VIII. The original mural also featured Henry's parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. The portrait was a celebration of the Tudor dynasty and its future. This version from the Walker Art Gallery's collection is one of the best-known portraits of Henry VIII. A number of versions of these portraits of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were produced during their marriage. Catherine married Henry VIII's older brother Arthur in 1501. However, Arthur died a short while later and Catherine went on to marry Henry. They were married for 20 years, but only one of their children, Mary, survived beyond infancy. Henry began to believe that the marriage was cursed and felt that God disapproved of him marrying his brother's widow. I think the history around Catherine of Aragon is really interesting. She was the youngest daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Henry VIII and Catherine were jointly crowned on the 24th of June, 1509. Their divorce sparked great religious change in England. A devout Catholic, Catherine saw herself as Henry's rightful wife until her death. No discussion of the Tudors is complete without discussing the Reformation. The Reformation saw a major change across 16th century Europe. Some people began to reject the Catholic Church and embrace Protestantism. By 1529, England was still a Catholic country, but tensions between England and Rome were building. Henry was now desperate to remarry. He had no male heirs and needed to secure the line of succession. Pope Clement VII refused to grant him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Henry instead used his power and influence to break from the Catholic Church. He married Anne Boleyn in 1533, but the Pope deemed this union void. In response, Henry moved to ensure separation from Rome was permanent. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. This declared Henry supreme head on earth of the Church of England. The Reformation caused a radical shift in English society. It was a time of widespread suspicion, distrust, and fear. Anne Boleyn was of noble birth and was educated at the French court. She served as lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon before marrying Henry VIII in secret in 1533. Henry began to doubt their union when they did not have a son. In 1536, Anne was charged with adultery and incest and was executed for treason. There are no known paintings of her from her time as queen. It is possible that her portraits were deliberately destroyed after her death. Jane Seymour acted as lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. She refused to become the king's mistress, and Jane and Henry were married just days after Anne Boleyn's execution. Jane gave birth to Edward on the 12th of October, 1537, but died a few days later. Though Henry was pleased to have a male heir finally, he wrote that divine providence has mingled my joy with the bitterness of the death of her who brought me this happiness. Following his own death, Henry was buried with Jane at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. This is an etching of Anne of Cleves. Anne was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves in modern-day Germany. Following Jane Seymour's death, Henry VIII looked to remarry in the hope of having more children. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, encouraged a match with Anne of Cleves. This union would help build alliances in mainland Europe. Holbein was sent to paint Anne's portrait, and Henry married her in 1540. Henry claimed he was not attracted to Anne, and the marriage was annulled after 6 months. Anne was given the title of the king's sister and received a generous allowance and several properties. So strange.
Catherine Howard is the wife of Henry VIII that I have a Christmas ornament of on my tree. And yes, she has a magenta dress.
The sixth and last of Henry VIII's wives, Catherine Parr, married the king at Hampton Court Palace on the 12th of July, 1543. When Henry was abroad for 2 months in the following year, she was appointed governor and protector of the realm. Catherine was the first woman in England to publish a book in English under her own name, which I find very interesting. She published Prayers or Meditations in 1545 and The Lamentation of a Sinner in 1547. This image is the earliest surviving full-length portrait of an English queen and is absolutely beautiful to see in person. Catherine Parr is the only English queen to be interred in a parish church, and I really enjoyed visiting her grave in St. Mary's Church at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. If you haven't seen my Sudeley Castle video, I will link it in the description as it's a really fantastic place to visit. Thomas Cromwell served as chief minister to Henry VIII from 1534 to 1540. He was one of the king's most valued advisors and played a key role in the English Reformation. Cromwell fell from Henry's favor after he encouraged the king's match with Anne of Cleves. He was executed for treason on the 28th of July, 1540, the same day that Henry married Catherine Howard. This is a painting of William Warham, or Warham, I don't know how you say his name. Anyway, he was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1503, and in 1527, he and Thomas Wolsey agreed to secretly investigate obtaining a divorce for Henry and Catherine of Aragon. It is said that Warham often used the phrase "Ira principis mors est," the king's anger is death. And now to mention something that we have discussed many times in prior videos of mine when I have visited abbey ruins and destroyed monasteries: the dissolution of the monasteries. By 1535, Henry was facing financial trouble. He set his sights on the wealthy Catholic monasteries. Some people in England had begun to embrace religious reform, but monasteries were still widely respected. They were seen as places of education and charity. As Henry himself later phrased it, any attempt to target them needed political handling. The Buggery Act was introduced in 1533. It outlawed the detestable and abominable vice of buggery. While there were very few formal charges under the act during Henry's reign, it became an important tool in his attack on the monasteries. In 1535, agents were sent to England's monasteries. Their job was to uncover scandal. The reports were damning, and many monks were accused of same-sex activity. The findings were met with uproar when they were read in Parliament. By 1541, the monasteries had been dissolved. Their riches were transferred to Henry and his supporters. This is Sir Thomas More. He was a close advisor of Henry VIII and was Lord High Chancellor of England from 1529. More wrote a poem comparing friendship with the king to having fun with tamed lions. He wrote, "Often it is harmless, but just as often there is fear of harm. Often he roars in rage for no reason, and suddenly the fun becomes fatal." More was beheaded in 1535 for refusing to recognize Henry's supremacy over the Church of England. This is King Edward VI. Edward was Henry VIII's only legitimate son. He was only 9 years old when he became King Edward VI. Henry VIII's will named a trusted council of 16 men to support Edward until he reached the age of 18. This portrait was painted in 1547 and was initially intended to celebrate Edward's position as the Prince of Wales. The royal arms were added at a late stage of the painting process after the death of Henry to reflect Edward's accession to the throne. Edward VI became seriously ill in 1553. It became clear that he would not survive, casting uncertainty over England's future. There were fears that the throne would pass to Mary, the daughter of Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Mary was devoutly Catholic. If she became queen, she could undo her father's reforms and restore Catholicism to England. Edward had been raised as a Protestant, and a plan was formed to disinherit Mary. This plan also meant that Edward's other half-sister, Elizabeth, was also disinherited, despite being Protestant. Edward named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as heir to the throne. A committed Protestant, she would support the Reformed Church of England. Edward VI died when he was 15 years old, probably of tuberculosis. Lady Jane Grey was declared queen 4 days later. Here is a painting of Lady Jane Grey, who from an early age showed great academic ability. She studied Protestant teachings and began learning Hebrew so she could read the original Old Testament text. Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen on the 10th of July, 1553. However, support for Mary grew quickly, and many of Jane's supporters abandoned her. The Privy Council of England changed sides and named Mary queen on the 19th of July, only 9 days later. Jane was found guilty of high treason and was held in the Tower of London. Her father later supported an uprising against Mary. This prompted Mary to have Jane beheaded on February 1554, when she was only about 16 or 17 years old. Jane is now often known as the 9 Days Queen. As queen, Mary I restored Roman Catholicism to England. She married her cousin Philip II of Spain in 1554, and they ruled jointly. Their marriage was deeply unpopular. Many English nobles were afraid of losing their authority to a foreign king. Mary I would later be remembered as Bloody Mary. During her reign, she executed hundreds of people for heresy. Mary died during a flu epidemic in 1558. She had no children, which meant her half-sister Elizabeth would take the throne. And now for Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth was crowned in 1558. She reigned for 45 years and is one of the most famous English monarchs. For many years, there had been uncertainty over the line of succession. Neither Edward VI or Mary I had secured a male heir. Elizabeth was 25 when she came to the throne. One of Parliament's first requests to her was that she should marry. Elizabeth had already avoided attempts to force her into a marriage. She used her unmarried status to her political advantage. Elizabeth would play off English and foreign suitors. Ultimately, she chose not to marry and to rule alone. Elizabeth reversed Mary's Catholic reforms. The Protestant Church of England was secured during her long reign. Robert Dudley was Elizabeth I's long-standing favorite courtier and suitor. Dudley hosted the Queen for an extravagant 19-day visit to Kenilworth Castle in 1575. It was a final, unsuccessful attempt to win her hand in marriage. A childhood friend of Elizabeth's, Dudley claimed that she always insisted she would never marry. At one point, Elizabeth suggested that Dudley wed her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, which he refused to do. This is Robert Devereux, who was a favorite of Elizabeth I's. He was described as having a nature not to be ruled. Devereux lost his place at court when he failed to crush rebellion in Ireland in 1599. He was disgraced further when he tried to raise a revolt against Elizabeth's government and was executed for treason in 1601. Elizabeth I had many rivals. One of the most powerful was her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, Margaret. This made Mary a serious threat to Elizabeth's claim to the throne. Henry VIII had declared his marriage to Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, void. Pope Pius V had excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570 and declared her illegitimate. Her authority was therefore questioned throughout Europe. Henry VIII had tried to arrange a marriage between his son Edward and Mary, Queen of Scots. This would unify the family and the kingdoms of England and Scotland. But the plan failed, and Mary was sent to be raised in France. Mary then married the heir to the French throne and became Queen of France in 1559 at the age of 16. Her husband died a year later, and she returned to Scotland to rule her kingdom directly. From there, Mary also wanted to assert her claim to the English throne. Mary, Queen of Scots, did not challenge Elizabeth directly. Instead, she wanted to be named heir to the throne. Elizabeth refused. Mary was Catholic, and there were fears she would reverse religious reforms. Following years of instability in Scotland, Mary abdicated as ruler in 1567 and fled to England. Her infant son became James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth had Mary imprisoned in 1563, but was reluctant to execute her. This went against the wishes of Elizabeth's closest advisors, including Francis Walsingham, the Queen's Secretary of State. Walsingham had a network of spies and informers and monitored Mary's letters. He discovered a plan to rescue Mary and to assassinate Elizabeth. He allowed this plot to unfold in order to incriminate Mary. Mary was tried for treason and beheaded in 1587. She had spent over 18 years under house arrest. Elizabeth I died without an heir in 1603. Mary's son succeeded her and became James I of England and Ireland. This portrait of Elizabeth was painted of her when she was in her late 50s, about my age. She does look like a rather severe and terrifying woman in this likeness. In addition to refusing to marry, Elizabeth also refused to name an heir. This made her the end of the line, the last of the Tudors. I was glad to have seen this very well done exhibition about the Tudors during our visit to Liverpool. I hope you enjoyed coming along. Please check out these other Liverpool videos next. Thanks so much for watching, and do something good in the world today.